We are in our lecture 3 of OT hermeneutics. Is about history of biblical hermeneutics, and we may test you on how it proceeded. I want to begin by saying that biblical hermeneutics is a study of the principles of interpretation concerning the books of the Bible. It is part of the broader field of hermeneutics, which involves the study of principles of interpretation for all forms of communication, non-verbal and verbal. It is the science of interpreting what another has written. In Christian theology, hermeneutics focuses specifically on constructing and discovering the appropriate rules for interpreting the Bible. Now, these methods and principles, however, are often drawn from outside of Scripture in historical, literary, or other fields. It inevitably involves exegesis, which is the act of interpreting, or rather, it is the act of explaining the meaning of Scripture by digging into the historical context, immediate context. Sometimes you start with wider context. When you read a certain text, you start from far, that is wider context, and then historical context, or you pick one of the two, wider or historical, and then you move to immediate context, that is exegeting the text. As you move on, you also ask, who are the intended audience? How do they relate to the present society? And then you go word by word, verse by verse, trying to exegete or explain. So it's all about exegesis, it's all about explaining the text. And you see, there's a very thin line between hermeneutics and exegesis. Now, the goal in applying the principles of hermeneutics is to rightly handle the word of truth, as you read in 2 Timothy 2:15, and striving to accurately discern the meaning of the text. Therefore now, hermeneutics is indeed the art of understanding a given text. Now, when you think of exegesis, what is it? Sometimes you may give the same definition of exegesis, though if you broaden the meanings and the explanations, you find they are not the same, they are different. Now, a brief history of the development of biblical hermeneutics. This is not the place to offer a full or complete history of OT hermeneutics. Such histories are offered in a number of works and in more detail than we can present here in this module. Nevertheless, our threefold orientation to the text provides a useful framework for capturing the major issues in biblical hermeneutics as they have unfolded. As a result of the shape of this volume, we will orient our comments specifically, though not exclusively, to OT hermeneutics on interpretation, namely interpretive development. It is agreeable to a number of OT scholars, such as West, Barton, Rattigan, among others, that shifts in biblical interpretation has taken place. So, OT hermeneutics or any hermeneutics has shifted considerably. There's a lot of change. Something else to consider in looking at the history of OT hermeneutics, or hermeneutics for that matter, is what we call interpretive crisis. Interpretive crisis, by looking at it, we start by appreciating that the shift occurred with the advent and subsequent influence of structuralism, which was reflected in a move from an interest in the origins of a given text to an interest in the text itself. Text had become the focus. This interpretive style focused on the text without external factors. This made scholars to move away from the genetic fallacy, explanation in terms of origins, and the referential fallacy, explanation in terms of external factors. In some ways, the history of OT hermeneutics begins as early as the biblical account itself. In the OT, the latter writings, like the Psalms and the Prophets, reinterpret the story of Israel presented in the Torah. The dominant feature of recent developments in the field of hermeneutics is a shift from the text itself towards an interest in the relationship between the text and the reader. The majority of scholars, however, point to the fact that the reader is no longer seen as a mere spectator, but as active, as creative, as well as a contributor in the interpretation process. Now, David Tracy realizes the instability generated by this shift, and in recent years we have come a long way from the now old new criticisms belief in the stability of an autonomous text. We are in the midst of a deconstructive drive designed to expose the radical instability of all texts and the inevitable intertextuality of all seemingly autonomous texts. The one stable author has been replaced by the unstable reader. Written texts seem commonsensical, stable enough, but when we reflect on any effort to understand them by interpreting them, they begin to seem far more puzzling and unstable than we first might have imagined. Now, this shift was quickly followed by the so-called Enlightenment in Europe. After the Industrial Revolution came Enlightenment. People thinking that they are now clever, they are now big, they are clever, sharp, and all that. As a critical turning point in the field of biblical interpretation. So shift went on with the socio-political formation. The shift has always manifested itself. You can also remember how independent churches came in central Kenya and Kenya in particular. You remember after the Bible was by 1940 translated into the mother tongue of some of the major languages in Kenya. That is the time independent churches started coming, because people read the Bible on their own, in their mother tongue, and they could interpret it, they could do their own hermeneutics. And the missionary hold on the Bible was lost. They found people asking them, "Who told you that thou shalt not marry two wives? Who told you thou shalt not circumcise your daughters?" Of course, I'm not saying I support some of the hermeneutical, progress in post biblical translation in central Kenya, particularly where there was all these crashes, especially 1929 when Mudrego dance came up to protest as a political protest, a cultural protest, to protest protest against the colonial and missionary interpretation of the Bible. So, coming up with their own Afro-biblical hermeneutics, Africans started forming their own churches where they incorporated their culture in the so-called Afro-biblical hermeneutics, which brought the Kikuyu Kalenga churches, or the typical cultural nationalist churches. And through the influences of Cartesian thought, Phaeronian skepticism, and English deism, Enlightenment scholars began to question the historicity of miracles. Taking you back to this shifting, so that I get you from the Kalenga business that I've just mentioned, and without losing the flow of information, I remind you that Enlightenment brought about new hermeneutics. So shift continued, and I was saying that through the influences of Cartesian thought, Phaeronian skepticism, what is called Phaeronian skepticism or doubting, and English deism, and Enlightenment scholars began to question the historicity of miracles, to search for the historical Jesus, to explore different types of text and sources, and generally to ask the kinds of historical questions we see in contemporary Old and New Testament introductions. Responding to this Enlightenment tradition, Friedrich Schleiermacher, often said to be the founder of modern hermeneutics and the philosophy of existentialism, him and Paul Sartre, the atheist, although they pulled the philosophy differently. Some were atheists, some were believers, but it is there we have existentialism philosophy. But again, also, this gentleman, Friedrich Schleiermacher, when he was in his home Danish church, he was not happy to hear how people were repeating sermons, how the sermons did not have meaning to people. People are not able to explain the text and give the correct meaning or the relevant meaning. And he started protesting, and that brought about the so-called modern hermeneutics. And this form of hermeneutics that Schleiermacher had in mind or was trying to propound focused on the mind of the author. What did the author of the text, what did he have in mind from the word go, along with the impact of his or her social historical setting as a means of gaining meaning from a given text. William Dithe followed in Schleiermacher's footsteps in focusing on the relationship between author and text in interpretation. Now, these various developments had a formative influence on the hermeneutical model that we will probably call traditional criticism, which is still frequently associated with the biblical exegesis. One can delineate three salient features that distinguish traditional criticism, and that is evolutionary models of biblical text, historical reconstructions, and original meaning. Although not all traditional critics would accept all of them or emphasize them in the same way as we are doing. As Norman Peterson explains, essential to the historical critical theory of biblical literature is the evolutionary model upon which it is constructed. This feature of traditional criticism points to the desire to determine the backgrounds of our biblical text and to develop theories tracing how we gained our current text from that background. For example, form criticism, often a tool employed in traditional criticism, uses the theories of of what the Germans call Religionsgeschichte, Religionsgeschichte Schule, that is history of religion school. Couldn't pronounce the German ones properly, to differentiate the individual units of the oral tradition that evolved into a biblical text. Now, this form critical analysis is usually based on source critical analysis. Thus, the evolutionary model begins with the existence and relationship of sources as part of their evolution. Reduction criticism, another of the tools of traditional criticism, and usually dependent on source and form criticism, seeks the context within the church that caused the editing of the biblical text to be tailored to meet the theological needs of the community at hand. Now, often, the goal of traditional criticism is to access the authenticity of the biblical text or the stories behind the text. We can see this trend in the source critical attempts to identify the earliest sayings of Jesus and stories within the biblical accounts. The various levels of authenticity in form of criticism serve a similar function. At times, biblical scholars have followed the philosopher Baruch Spinoza in bracketing out aspects of the biblical text to create a historical reconstruction of the background of the Bible. Now, seeking the original meaning of the text sounds somewhat similar to the goals of scholars doing textual criticism. Yet, the traditional search for the original meaning of the text not only looks at linguistic and philological questions, but also locates the text within its context among earlier texts and locates the original readers within their historical context. Now, modern scholars have recently joined traditional scholars in this quest. Modern practitioners of forms of traditional criticism include social scientific critics such as Bruce Mariner and Jerome Neri, and social rhetorical approaches such as that of Ben Witherington. And composition criticism, similar to reduction criticism, also follows traditional methods to varying degrees, even if it reflects newer developments. We can stop there and try to go back to where we were going through, and probably we talk a bit, see whether we have understood